Natalia. Dear participants, it's my pleasure to welcome you at our conference on local elections of 2020. We'll speak about the lessons learned, about conclusions, about recommendations. It was a big pleasure to work with you during 2 days. And now, for an hour and a half, we'll be wrapping up the work of eight breakdown groups. We are working in accordance with our agenda. I may remind you that the number of groups was eight, so we'll have eight presentations. I want the facilitators to be aware of the time limit, not more than 10 minutes for each presentation. Then we'll have 10 or 15 minutes for the Q&A. And all attendees will be able to ask questions of the moderators or of the facilitator. And then we'll have session two on legislative improvements and future practices. So let's begin. We have too much information to share. It was not an easy election. It was a very intensive election with many new changes, with many new challenges that we managed to respond to. And we want the electoral process of the future years to be more effective. So let's discuss. I will present on behalf of Group 1. We discussed electoral commissions, their formation, and or how to organize their proceedings. I thank everyone from my group for the active work. In the group, there were representatives of the CEC, of the TECs, deputies of some local councils, representatives of the academic community, judges, anti-corruption activists, all were working very actively. And we focused on four aspects. Number one, formation of the ECs. Number two, organization of the work of ECs and their members. Number three, the authority of TECs as legal entities, and the aspects of inclusion and accessibility. Let me begin with number one, with how commissions are formed. One of the challenges was the shortage of time for forming the commissions, holding their first meeting, getting the lists of the voters, especially in the context of reaching the register. And the recommendation is to amend the electoral code and to increase the relevant term from 15 days to 18 days. Absence of the institutional memory of the ECs is another challenge, and we discussed it at length. However, the relevant recommendations are in the same dimension as the issues related to the partisan and quota approach. We all agreed that the legislation may provide for full-time paid work of secretaries or other members of the commission. And another possibility is to launch the regional and territorial representative offices of the CEC. although funding for that is not available now. Another problem we discussed also at length was the issue of the lack of responsibility and liability of political parties, lack of their accountability for the candidates on their lists. Effects of manipulative approaches were identified. As for the recommendations, one of them is to engage bodies of local government as subjects entitled to form electoral commissions, review of the grounds for replacement of EC members with a limit on the number of possible replacements, and introduction of a final deadline upon expiration of which no replacements shall be allowed, especially in the leadership of the commissions. That's required for the sake of continuity, because otherwise further issues may emerge. Another recommendation is about early termination of the authority of the entire EC. This has to be specified at the legislative level in order to exclude any possibility of another inclusion of the same candidate into the new EC or to another TC. Plus, using a different procedure of forming ECs with casting lots and exclusion of the possibility to submit candidacies without lot casting. We are aware of two such instances, and they are to be excluded in the future. Regarding the lack of accountability, although we decided that it should be a separate point. Low qualification of the members of commissions, and we all agreed that a multi-level program of training and certification should be launched so that all members undergo trainings of a customized nature regarding with account of their functions and of their duties. These trainings should include specialized modules on funding or on specific procedures and compliance therewith. Such trainings can be conducted by the training center under CEC. It may be in charge of continuous training and advanced training of the members of ECs and of the specialists that are invited to work for ECs. Training for accountants was also mentioned, but that will be handled by another group in their presentation. The issue of the poor qualification of the members of our ECs may also be resolved by maintaining a register of certified candidates so that those who submit their lists know where to look for relevant individuals. That may also increase the level of responsibility of political parties, that responsibility that we spoke about earlier. Such a register of certified candidates may be maintained by the authority that maintains the state register, which has high credibility with the Ukrainian citizens. One of the recommendations was to consider the feasibility of two stages of the formation of ECs, with casting lots regarding party quotas at the first stage and submittal of candidacies at the second stage in accordance with the quotas. This proposal is pertaining not only to this aspect of our work, of others as well. And it is understandable that the scope of information to be processed is great. Therefore, data will become more fragmented and it will be easier for ECs and for other stakeholders to work. 27,000 candidates' data had to be processed, and that consumed a lot of time. Some issues now related to how to organize the proceedings of the Commission. The issues are excessive bureaucratization, and we had a very emotional discussion about this aspect, access to information on the decisions passed by the ECs. Representatives of the civil society indicated huge difficulties with that. And the third issue is the failure to notify or properly notify the members of the ECs about the date and venues of the meetings or their agenda. As for recommendations, we are aware that because of the lack of funding and because of the number of reforms that were implemented at the same time, Weber IC was not used as a full-fledged module, but we hope it will be possible in the future. The work of the commissions of lower level should be streamlined by a relevant decision of the CEC. Research has shown that with every new election, it becomes more and more difficult for commissions to perform their duties. And as for notification, the code should specify the procedure for annulment of a decision by the commission that has passed it, and to consider the proceedings organization in terms of personal and not collective liability. Well, I know that my time is expiring. Powers of the commissions as legal entities. Two issues here. Uh, Complicated public procurement procedures. They are very specific and very technical, and not too many are aware of all the details. So it is possible to either simplify the relevant legislation and to reconsider who specifically is going to be in charge of organizing the procurement process. And I think that CEC is able to help with resolving these issues. Accountants are underpaid, especially because they have to work after the end of the authority of the Commission. So this issue may be resolved by reviewing the contracts, the contract making procedure. As for inclusiveness and accessibility, we covered only two issues related to accessibility of the premises and poor awareness of all stakeholders about the notion of the citizens of low mobility. So we think that more awareness campaigns should be conducted with involvement of NGOs and territorial offices. As for infrastructure-related issues, practical measures should be taken in order to make all the polling stations physically accessible during future elections, and to continuously monitor all the changes after such measures are taken. Once again, with involvement of NGOs that possess all relevant information. These were the conclusions and recommendations of our group. I thank everyone for participation. And now I am giving the floor to group number 2. Yevhen Krikopoulos has the floor.
Дякую, Альона. Шановні колеги, шановні учасники, радий вітати вас на заключному дні нашої загальнонаціональної конференції. Як вже Альона зазначила, ми з колегами модерували роботу в робочій групі номер 2, яка була присвячена застосуванню виборчих систем на місцевих виборах. Нагадаю, що у 2020 році місцеві вибори в Україні вперше пройшли за новими виборчими системами. Взагалі одночасно застосовувалося 4 виборчі системи, 2 з яких були абсолютно нові для України. Хочу сказати, що наша робоча група дуже активно працювала, намагалася окреслити основні проблеми, недоліки застосування цих виборчих систем та запропонувати рекомендації щодо вирішення цих проблем. Зараз я з радістю і презентую результати напрацювання.
My great pleasure and honor to present to you the results of our work. So what we've discussed was first, a territorial organization of elections, design of the ballot paper, pluses and minuses of applying various election systems in the course of local elections. So the first issue we discussed was the feasibility of using proportional representation in smaller communities under 10,000 voters. Our recommendation is to consider feasibility of raising this minimal threshold for the application of party lists, open party lists. And one of the options was to apply the system to communities with more than 35,000 voters as a compromise option. Because oftentimes people complain that this system is too cumbersome for parties and for the voters themselves. The next one would be the neutralizing of the impact of voters on the election results. And here we mean the use of the proportional system with open lists, in that the system allows to minimize the impact of voters on the results of the elections. And here we speak about the application of additional qualifications. And
у списку в територіальному виборчому окрузі необхідно було набрати 20
the guaranteed mandate in the single list and distribution of mandates without taking on board the preferences of the voters. So when mandates are distributed in territorial election districts, so if some of the candidates got 25% or more, they could go up the list. But in the single list, that was not taken on board. So as a recommendation is to drop the requirement of this 25% of voters as an election quote to move up the list, or else to reduce this threshold to at least 10%. Of course, any recommendations that I am venting now are open to further discussion and better elaboration. When mandates are distributed within the single one mandate district, the results of those candidates in territorial communities should be taken on board so that they see which of the candidates really gets the mandate in that district, as well as some additional mandates. Another recommendation is to forgo the guaranteed mandate or just to streamline the procedure of guaranteeing such mandates as is in the case of parliamentary elections. I'll elaborate on this. While the overall election quota was determined, we take on board this guaranteed mandate, but then the election code remains silent as to how those mandates should be distributed within one district. So articles 257 and 260 should be revised so that this procedure is better streamlined, because the current procedure can result in the situation whereby a party that gets the right to distribute these mandates, get the guaranteed mandate if all of the mandates are distributed in territorial election districts. And very few votes are remaining for the party to distribute them within their single election or electoral list. Another issue raised by the working group was a disproportionate number of voters in different election districts in Oblast, Rayon, and Kiev City Council elections. Recommendations to streamline criteria for forming such territories of the districts. For example, to be guided by the number of the voters there with, say, 10 to 10% of the margin, according to the international standards. And take on board administrative and territorial division of the country. As matters stand, when the election districts are being formed, the administrative and territorial division is taken on board, whereas the number of voters in certain districts is not. So since it is a proportional election system, I think we should actually eliminate this disproportional distribution of the number of voters. And it does not contribute to creating a level playing field in different districts. The next issue would be the new design of the ballot paper in proportional elections, and some people saw that as an issue because it was fairly difficult to fill it in. For the voters, there were a lot of void ballot papers just because of the difficulty with explaining it. It was up to 7% in the proportional districts and very low in the majority districts. And low accessibility for people with impaired, visually impaired, and people with physical disability. So recommendations to look for the optimal design of the ballot paper and simplify their structure so that voters can just make one tick And that would be enough without the need to write the number of the candidate on the ballot paper. In addition, the voters will not have to make several marks. That will make the life of and the activities of people with disability, including impaired vision, simpler, easier. Then perhaps additional tools could be provided, like magnifying glasses, special stencils, and the size of the font, or font size. Because many people complain that even without being visually impaired, they had to actually overcome certain difficulties reading the names of the candidates. Then the costs of the use of the system of absolute majority. Sometimes the second round of the elections was to be organized, and a lot of communities did not change their opinion between the two rounds. So additional requirements under which the second round might not be conducted was if the gap between the first and the second successful candidates is fairly large. And there were some other proposals, like we considered international practices whereby in order to be elected, the most successful candidate should get 45% rather than 50% and one vote. If the gap is more than, say, 20 or 10%, and we still have to give more consideration to this issue. That is all I wanted to say. Thank you very much for your attention. And I can now pass the floor to Group 3. Thank you very much. I will now give the floor to our colleague, Mr. Grisham, discussing or describing what happened during our working group discussion. We had more than 50 experts who were very insistent and very proactive, and sometimes their recommendations were mutually exclusive. We got a lot of ideas in the chat, and once the discussion in the working group was over, we actually summarized all of those recommendations. We also received some recommendations in email after the completion of the working group's operation. I would like to underscore that all of the proposals that we've received will be taken into account. We tried to summarize at least those that were available to us yesterday and today in the morning. And here is our presentation.
В нашій робочій групі ми розглядали питання, які пов'язані були з дотриманням.
In our working group, we looked at the issues with observing gender quotas during the nomination of candidates and during the entire election process, then nomination of candidates by local chapters of political parties, and regularity of making and publication of CEC decisions on this nomination and registration. Now, a lot of working group participants said that some parties conducted manipulations with their electoral lists when they did not provide the necessary documents for the women candidates so that they were deregistered or not registered for formal reasons. So we believe that the code should establish such a nomination procedure whereby the very nomination requirements meet the gender quota requirements, then courts apply the code provisions on gender quotas differently. So the case law of administrative courts should be streamlined so that there is no divergency and differences in the application of the code provisions. Besides, parties sometimes fail to understand the essence of quotas. They were not prepared to nominate sufficient number of women because of the in-party competition. And we agreed that perhaps the best way would be to raise awareness and train party representatives on the essence of the quota and make special focus on eliminating sexism in political life in our country at large. Besides, women were not quite active in getting nominated or in volunteering to get nominated. The way to address it is to raise awareness amongst women. We should train potential women candidates, and we should provide the necessary assistance to political parties in this regard. TECs, when they received the documents, registration documents, did not quite understand that feminitives are not technical problems or typos. During the discussion, we heard lots of different opinions about the use of feminitives in the Ukrainian language, and our recommendation is to get it regulated by primary or secondary legislation. Another issue raised was that the code does not regulate the attendance of party conferences or party congresses by TEC members. Thus, the parties failed to notify TECs on the date or the venue of their party conferences or congresses. There were recommendations on how that can be addressed by legislation. And some people say that these norms should be dropped whatsoever because TECs, they would argue, have nothing to do with this procedure. Another recommendation is to amend the political party law to provide for better openness and transparency in party conferences and congresses that nominate local election candidates. We also discussed the issue of the clone candidates or twin candidates. We heard a whole variety of opinions, but no matter how hard you try to regulate it in the legislation, be it primary or secondary, this problem cannot be addressed at that level. So we should put more effort into investigating this case and improve political culture in the Ukrainian society. Another issue was that candidates can get registered at the same time in different districts, different levels of councils, or run from different parties. And the election commissions can do nothing with that. So, and sometimes they're elected into several councils at a time, and election authorities cannot actually trace and track that. So several recommendations ensued, like when the documents are, registration documents are submitted, they should be entered into the uniform or single electronic system, the single database for all candidates that should be reconciled within this database and with the state voters register should be carried out. Another issue is the use of discriminatory political advertising by political parties during the campaign. So, and here we spoke about awareness raising, about education, and about enhancing parties' responsibility and accountability for the use of such discriminatory language in their advertising. We also noted that parties are entitled to nominate candidates at all levels from their oblast-based chapter. So we believe that just local chapters should also be present, and local chapters should or district, or say city or town chapters should nominate their candidates to respective councils. And if the candidate is running on the list of different parties, so his or her document should be returned to him or her or to their parties for streamlining. There's the issue of amending ballot papers is not regulated when a candidate, for example, passed away after the ballot papers were printed. Likewise, one of the problems invented or raised was that a person in the leadership of the party remains the party member until he or she is replaced in this very position. So, and the registers of the Ministry of Justice provide the relevant information about this person. So thus they have got difficulty with leaving the party or being nominated by other political parties. A recommendation is to have this issue regulated by the code and relevant legislation or related legislation. Then the law does not sufficiently regulate how the identification and correction of mistakes can be carried out. And the recommendation is to get it better regulated by the code. We also discussed the divergences in case law on the monetary deposits. So this should be also addressed at the legislative level. Now, and if a party's oblast chapter, for example, nominates candidates for different level councils, banks use different practice in terms of how to address savings accounts and current accounts. So a recommendation is to allow oblast chapters of political parties to open one savings account and several current accounts at different levels of the elections. Another issue would be that Part 5, Article 218 of the Code provides for the need for the TEC to transfer data on registered parties and their organizations to the Ministry of Justice and CEC. So the parties don't know how they have to communicate this information to TECs and the Ministry of Justice during the runoff elections or the second round of the elections. That is it. Thank you very much for your attention, colleagues. Thank you. Thank you, Oleg. We would like to
Thanks,
thank the
Oleg. We
participants of
thank
this group.
everyone from number 3.
May I remind you
May
that we've
once
got
again remind
a
you
chat,
that if you have questions, you may
and you can ask your
use
questions in the
the
chat.
chat format. Well, we already see quite a list of different issues that overlap, so to speak, between the agendas of different groups. So I will request all forthcoming speakers not to repeat what others have said. And now it's the turn of group number 4. The quarantine-related matters. Good morning, dear colleagues. Our group discussed the present situation related to the quarantine and the response. These conditions were quite critical. They required rapid response, and it was not easy for our group to work because we did not have ample time to analyze all the amassed experience. However, we developed our recommendations. Let me share my screen and inform you about our deliberations. This is the list of matters we discussed. Analysis of the application of the anti-epidemic measures and means, identifying the sources and the procedures of financing of the anti-epidemic measures, regulating the new procedures and organization and conduct of elections in the conditions of quarantine in the context of compliance with the of respecting the rights of the citizens. Problems of financing. The key challenge we indicated was the uncertainty of the financing procedures. Local budgets were not ready to provide all the funding for additional means and measures of anti-quarantine nature. And the participants also spoke about local budgets having no funds for making the procurements. So the relevant recommendation is as follows. If the election is conducted in the situation of a pandemic, all the necessary anti-quarantine means should be procured in a centralized manner. As such, measures should be conducted by an authority different from the Electoral Commission. And another important logistical aspect is considering the available experience in order to create an equal playing field for all ECs. Another set of issues has to do with the personnel-related aspects. Specifically, that has to do with the failure to abide by the requirements regarding anti-quarantine measures. And the list of issues we are going to share is just the minimum. Electoral commissions were not properly provided with anti-COVID means. Some measures could not be taken, like, for example, airing was not always possible because of the absence of vents or windows that would open. Occasionally, members of the commissions as well as the voters ignored the need to comply with the anti-epidemic measures. the specific procedure of the tabulation of vote made it impossible to fully comply with the requirements against the quarantine. Some commissions had to work for very many hours, and occasionally it was physically impossible to provide them with the proper number of masks, or individuals just forgot to change their masks. And many just ignored the need to comply with the procedure. It was also not easy to organize all the anti-epidemic measures because that implied additional duties for members of the electoral commissions. They had not only to perform their direct duties, but also to take care of the temperature screening or to observe the social distance or to be involved with disinfection measures. We are also aware that some commissions had no possibility to assign specific individuals to be responsible for anti-epidemic measures. And all that certainly increased, so to speak, the caseload on commission members. Recommendations to consider the feasibility of going by alternative modes of voting, or the feasibility of organizing voting during several days in order to decrease the number of people who are in the polling station at a certain point of time. Thus, the possibility to vote not on one day but on several days may really decrease the risk of overcrowding and be conducive to better control. Our group also understands that all this cannot be done quickly because it requires high-level decisions with previous all-national discussions. Another recommendation is to review the mechanism of penalizing for failure to comply with anti-epidemic requirements. This mechanism really requires revisiting and reviewing, and further efforts should be taken in terms of a better awareness campaigns, because some people may not fully understand the anti-epidemic needs. We also discussed the specific features of the anti-epidemic measures implementation. We are aware of the instances when booths for the voting of individuals with disability were used for the voting of individuals with respiratory disease symptoms. That created additional risks to the elderly and to the people with disability who were making use of the same booths. Therefore, the requirements were not fully met at all polling stations. Occasionally, abidance with anti-epidemic requirements led to failures to fully respect the right to vote or specific procedures, like, for example, access of political parties, conferences. Uh, we were informed that occasionally references to the anti-epidemic means served as grounds not to allow visitors and observers in. So our relevant recommendation is to adapt the electoral procedures to the needs of conducting elections in the conditions of the pandemic. Many issues have to do with the present regulations. Many aspects should be regulated properly at different levels, either in the electoral code or by the cabinet of ministers or by sectoral agencies. One of the sub-issues on this list is the lack of clear-cut rules regarding centralized provisions of the individual means of protection for commission members. Yes, there are some general provisions and some specifications of the individual protection means, but there is no specific regulatory act on making relevant procurements for members of electoral commissions, as a result of which means of individual protection were not always available. Specifically, it concerned the sufficient number of gloves and their timely replacement. Uncertainty regarding the procedures of implementation of specific measures, like testing of the members of commissions. Such testing was recommended on the eve of the election day, but there were no specifications in the regulations about who pays for the procedure or where to undergo it. There were also special procedures of submitting applications for voting at home for those who have contracted COVID-19. And they also had to get certificates or statements from the healthcare institutions. Another issue on this list is that the present provisions of the code do not contain anything about the grounds for the replacement of the entire composition of an electoral commission should one member fall ill, and the present procedures of the transfer of documentation are also not conducive to compliance with the anti-epidemic measures, because all the documents are to be transported to the higher commission right after tabulation, and as a result of that, social distancing and other requirements are not observed because too many people crowd on the same premise. Therefore, relevant amendments in the regulations are required, where they have to do with the standards, norms, and amounts of provisions and supplies. Another recommendation is to review the procedure for voting at home in case of COVID contraction, review of the procedure of the replacement of the entire composition of the commission, and review of the procedure of the transportation and transfer of documents with the expansion of the possibilities. Other issues have to do with the efficiency and effectiveness of the anti-epidemic measures, because it is quite possible that voters will not want to go vote in the assigned booths, being afraid to contract the COVID. Contactless thermometers are quite costly and many of them are not accurate. So the recommendation is quite simple: to analyze the anti-epidemic measures and to review them. Some other issues have to do with the perceptions and with the psychologies. Not all voters are quite sure that public authorities are really ready to ensure their safety. And the last issue that we discussed in our group, although we had no time to find these solutions, had to do with organizing the performance of the ECs. And we discussed that in the context of manipulations under the pretext of COVID contraction or illness, and forming the electoral commissions at the so-called special ECs, where sometimes ECs were not formed at all because no relevant candidacies were submitted. Allegedly, individuals just did not want to act as members of such commissions. And one final recommendation of our working group is to create a working group or party, maybe under the National Security and Defense Council, that would bring together all the amassed experience, analyze the lessons learned in the context of all forthcoming elections. Thank you.
Спасибі, Анастасія.
Thank you, Anastasia. I would like to also thank the group members for numerous recommendations. There is a lot to do to implement them in practice. So we had recommendations on the operation of ECs, on registration of candidates, on elections funding, etc. But we had a separate group that focused on the COVID-related matters. Group 5 worked with financing of local elections, campaign finance, and election reporting. It was dealing with the new practices, and I will give the floor to Julia Salzburg to report back to the plenary. Thank you, Alona. I will be presenting the outcomes of our discussion in Group 5. As Alona said, we worked on our most essential topic of financing of local elections, campaign finance, and election reporting. And I would like to thank all of the group members for their contributions, for their impact, and for a very qualified discussion. Within this topic, we focused on the following issues: funding of local elections at the expense of the national and local budgets, and guarantees for the proper funding of elections. The next one was financing of local elections at the expense of election funds of local chapters of political parties, candidates, and funding of campaign finance. Then financial reporting of candidates and political parties, form of such reports, procedures, and timeframes for submission, and monitoring and control over the election funds. So when it comes to the election financing in general, we spoke about the lack of efficiency of the funding mechanisms when it comes to state budget and local budgets. The major thing is that local councils take decisions on allocating funds for the preparation and running of the second round of elections too late. Our group came up with a number of recommendations. The first would be to change approach to the funding of the runoffs of elections, so that the mechanisms used for the funding of regular local elections be applied, so that the costs related to the preparation and administration of repeat elections or runoff of the elections could be funded from the local budgets as a separate subvention from the state budget. And powers relating to funding of the second round should be vested in TECs or regional representations of CECs, or local state administrations that will be funding such elections at the expense of the state budget. The next issue that we identified was poor remuneration to the EC members. This is a complex actually issue, and it was discussed not only in our working group but in some other groups as well. And we believe that the remuneration should be at the expense of the parties and candidates as well as the budget. Besides, there should be clear-cut requirements pertaining to the qualifications of the EC members. So our recommendation is to make sure that the EC members get decent remuneration, either at the expense of the state budget or the funds of the parties and candidates from their monetary deposits, and to introduce the professional training for the EC members. The next issue was the lack of consistency in the legislation on public procurement for the national elections and for local elections. As matters stand, the law on public procurement does not cover the procurements of, say, ballot papers for the national elections, presidential elections, or parliamentary elections, but it does not cover the local elections. And TECs had difficulties procuring the necessary, say, supplies, particularly given the short-term campaign period. So we had various opinions on possible solutions. First was amending the public procurement law to make it consistent with the requirements of various types of elections, and to, again, vest the responsibility and the powers of ensuring seamless public procurement with the territorial and regional representation or rep offices of CEC. So when it comes to the funding of local elections at the expense of local budgets is that there's lack of consistency in the formation of election funds at the parliamentary and presidential elections on the one hand and local elections on the other. Thus, there is no level playing field for the self-nominees and for the party nominees. So today, the legislation sets up certain limits on the contributions or donations to the election funds. Those caps are very high when it comes to presidential parliamentary elections, more than 1,800,000 hryvnias, by individuals, more than 3.6 million hryvnias for legal entities. But for the local elections, legal entities cannot contribute to election funds, and individuals can only donate or actually input or invest up to 50,000 hryvnias. As a result, candidates cannot attract funds and cannot invest into those election funds. But parties can support them. Self-nominees have no such opportunity. So we believe that these rules pertaining to the formation of election funds should be streamlined for all types of elections. The next issue is related to some difficulties with opening up elections accounts for election funds. What is meant here? Organizations of parties of a higher level, say oblast chapters, could nominate candidates to councils of different levels. And even if they do so, they had to open up several accounts of their election funds, which entailed a number of difficulties. And our recommendation is to simplify legislative requirements in this regard and allow party chapters that nominate candidates for elections of different levels to open one savings account, but in their financial reports, they should provide details as to what costs were borne for the campaigning, for example, at what level of elections. The next issue would be the premature start of campaigning, actually long before the official election process was launched. Usually, we can't see the costs of that campaigning or canvassing. So our recommendation will be, on the one hand, to extend the duration of the campaign, and on the other hand, to allow potential participants of the election processes to open up their accounts even before the official campaign starts or is launched. The next issue is a lack of regulation on the funding of campaign in the internet, including in social media. NGOs, public organizations monitored local elections and parliamentary elections, and they say that the use of online advertising has doubled in the scales and intensity. But we don't have any proper regulation on campaigning online. So we have to do additional research with the invitation of experts in this area, SMM areas, and or else to drop this online campaigning whatsoever, because it is difficult to monitor. And then the procedures for remunerating canvassers was not transparent. May I remind you that you've only got 2 minutes to finish your presentation, so please make it more concise, will you? Okay. So the recommendation was to streamline all the requirements regarding remuneration to canvassers and bring it in accord with the law on volunteering. The next issue was not related with financing of elections themselves, but rather to financial reporting. And TECs did not have a capacity to timely publicize their financial reports. And this can be addressed through having a separate module within the electronic register administered by National Agency for Preventing Corruption. Next issue is lack of proper and timely access to data on campaign financing by voters. So they seldom had an opportunity to see the costs borne by various political parties before the election day that would enable them to make informed choice. So a separate electronic system should be developed for publicizing financial reports at a certain deadline, at least no later than the day after they are submitted. Another issue raised was the too complicated form or sophisticated form of financial reports. And the proposal was to make this financial reporting form simpler and to amend the CEC regulations accordingly. Now, control of the use of election funds. We spoke about the professional qualifications of TEC members in the context of monitoring and analyzing financial reports. So we believe that these functions should be vested in some other agencies, perhaps at some point in future to territorial and regional rep offices of CEC, or else on the National Agency for Preventing Corruption. The next issue would be no definition at the level of the law of the powers of election commissions to carry out random control of inputs, of donations, and accounting and use of those funds. This makes it impossible to get information timely. And here the proposal was to increase the timeframes for the analysis of those reports, or else to shift these functions and vest them in some other controlling agencies and introduce electronic reporting systems. Next issue is ineffective control by the political parties of the entire organization of the formation and use of their election funds. So perhaps the liability or the responsibility, accountability for failure to do so would be envisioned in the legislation. Two more problems here: disproportionate responsibility or liability for violating rules of election financing, and authorities or competent authorities do not communicate amongst themselves and do not cooperate properly. There is also an issue with the quality of documents that they draw, and also a lack of uniform case law. So certain administrative and criminal sanctions should be streamlined so that they are more proportional and better coordinated among themselves. And then lack of the unavoidable punishment for violations related to election financing. So here we believe that better communication and cooperation amongst the competent authorities could be a solution, and better awareness raising and information campaigns can also be a solution. Thank you very much, dear colleagues, and I will give the floor to the moderator. Thank you
Thanks.
very much. Great
Your
job.
group did a very good job. Thank you for the presentation.
Мають новий ЗНО, так, і викликають потребу в поєднанні. Ми з вами переходимо до
We now
етапу роботи.
switch
Презентація групи номер 6, яка
over to group number 6,
результатів виборів.
tabulation of votes. Anastasia Matvienko and Yevhen Kirikovo. Thanks, Alona, Anastasia, and I will try to be brief when presenting the results of Group 6's proceedings. Tabulation of the votes and establishment of the results of the election. We already mentioned the impact of the new system on the entire process, all the way up to transportation of the ballots. The participants of our groups identified some new issues as well as some regular ones that are observed at all elections. So what did we discuss? Making the protocols and relevant difficulties, delays with the registration of elected deputies because of court proceedings, the procedure of replacement, and the mechanism of reinstatement of the violated election rights. So first, let's address the complexity of the tabulation procedure. Well, the very process of filling the protocols out manually is very complex. It really was taking a lot of time of the members of electoral commissions. The premises of the commissions were not sufficient for the large number of people working there. The continuous nature of the meeting of the CSC is really unrealistic because it may cause issues with the right to rest. And we also observed some complications in those cities where there is no division into districts. There, overcrowding on the premises was especially noticeable. We recommend that all documentation from precinct commissions is transported to the district commissions just in order to avoid overcrowding. It was also suggested that the premises should be properly audited, and some examples of good practices were quoted, like the use of stadiums or other spacious areas. And a recommendation that may solve many issues is deployment of the Vyborы information system all the way down to the level of precinct commissions. Another issue is the incompatibility of the two types of protocols, and the very simple recommendation is to make these forms uniform. While the code indicates what such protocols should look like, and the difference is about the number of ballots received by voters, which is present in the former but absent in the latter. On October 22nd, the CEC came up with a resolution where it indicated that in such instances, the territorial commissions are to fill the absent field, but probably not all could read the resolution. Another issue has to do with access to the meeting of the commission during tabulation. Yet another difficulty has to do with different grounds for specification of protocols or the conduct of a secondary tabulation. That's why we recommend further trainings of the members of TECs during the period between the election and to launch certification of the members of the TECs so that they'll become more professional. We also propose that the scanned copies of protocols are forwarded to the territorial commissions for automated processing that will make it possible to immediately trace any mistakes. But certainly this recommendation will lose its importance if the Vibore information system is implemented. Another recommendation is about discarding the procedure of specification of protocols. And yet another option is to simplify the procedure of secondary tabulation without counting the signatures of the voters or the unused ballots. Our group also mentions the complex system of establishing the results under the proportionate system, specifically some mathematical errors. Therefore, Vibore system deployment may be the solution, as well as more specific provisions of the law on the mechanism of restoring the violated rights of electors in case some mistakes are found. So that's all from me, and now may I hand the floor over to Anastasia. Let me continue. Thanks, Yevhen. The presently available experience with tabulation shows that there is some inconsistency between the electoral code and the laws on the local self-government and the status of deputies of local councils. There is no procedure to restore the election-related rights of candidates in cases a mandate was granted inappropriately and or when the relevant powers were assigned to other candidates. And thus there is no way to terminate the authority of such candidates. There is no procedure to reinstate the rights in case of inappropriate termination of the mandate. territorial commissions may terminate the authority of certain deputies, but then the court may decide otherwise. Then, therefore, there is no procedure to go by in such an instance. A related issue is that the procedure for establishing the results of the elections do not provide for proper consideration of the possible challenging of the result of the election. And as a result, it becomes impossible to strip a candidate of his or her authority. Our recommendation is to provide for additional grounds for termination of authority of the deputies of local councils, to properly coordinate the time frames for establishing the results and the time frames for appealing against the results of the election. Let me now address how to organize the work of election commissions at the time of acknowledgement of electoral documentation. The issues here are the inappropriate level of competence, poor understanding of the legislation, absence of political neutrality and impartiality of the members of the ECs, which in practice often leads to illegitimate decisions, abuse of their right to vote against in the decision-making process, specifically during the voting for registration of elected candidates. This is a requirement of the code, but in practice, in commissions, some members abuse their right to vote against, and then the commission has not enough votes to decide on registration of the deputy. Absence of personal liability of EC members is a separate issue. We recommend to conduct relevant trainings during the period between elections to certify EC members and to introduce an obligation to make decisions without voting in the context of a specific electoral procedures, like registration of elected candidates. And another mechanical issue also calls for consideration and a solution. I refer to the lack of standards regarding packaging materials for different documents. Different materials are used, even wallpaper. So our recommendation is very simple, to provide a clear-cut list of packaging materials and to provide such materials to the election commission. Thank you for your elections, for your attention. Dear colleagues, two groups are yet to present. Pavlo Romaniuk will speak on behalf of group number 7, and Mikhaila Herkusha will speak on behalf of group 8, so I will ask them to be very brief. Pavlo? Thanks, Alona. I thank all attendees. It's our last day of last day of the conference, and I thank everyone who organized this conference, and I thank all who worked in the working groups. Our group was pretty active and quite professional. The members of our group were representatives of the academic communities, judges, practicing lawyers, members of ECs, and civic activists. And I thank them for participation in the discussion and their input into the list of our recommendations. My co-facilitator was Bogdan Mohanchuk, so I will speak also on his behalf. We focused on three areas: legal regulations and application of the law, case law on election-related disputes, specifically different application of the electoral law by different courts and liability of members of ECs. Our list of issues has 15 points. The number of recommendations is even greater. So as for the problems with legal regulations, many of them have to do with the deficiencies in the existing hierarchical approach to considering the complaints by ECs. This is really a complex issue. That's why we all agreed that the existing hierarchy of ECs entitled to consider complaints should be reviewed. The relevant criteria should be discussed in detail at different platforms. We also recommend to widen the list of commissions entitled to act in case of omission of authority on the part of electoral commissions of lower standing. We also note the déjà vu regarding a recurrent issue to do with the jurisdiction of the authorities entitled to consider election disputes. We need clear-cut criteria in this context. We also mentioned that courts and ECs consider cases going by different time frames and deadlines. We need uniformity here. 5 days as before, although some members of our groups expressed different opinions and refer to the amendments to the EC of 2019. Representatives of the civic society drew our attention to the issues related to the 2 days time limit for considering complaints on the day of elections. Therefore, relevant amendments are required to the election code, and more attention should be given to this matter at the trainings for ECs, with emphasis on immediacy of considering such complaints.
Окрім того, наступною проблемою варто виділити, що
An-
звертали
Another issue also raised by the judges was uncertainty regarding what courts should hear cases related to making amendments to the register. We know that some such cases are to be heard by administrative courts, while all those disputes that have to do with the register are to be decided by the circuit administrative courts. Therefore, relevant rules should be reviewed, and all such disputes are resolved by just one court.
Так, трішки, будь ласка, лаконічніше. Тому що
Please try to be briefer.
найбільший, і я не забуду.
Well, I am going to finish my presentation soon. Number 8, lack of the legislatively specified procedure regarding what is to be done in case a lawsuit is issued in violation of the jurisdiction provisions in the administrative legislation of Ukraine. As for the case law, the election-related disputes, the key issue is lack of uniformity in the application of law by different courts, and it was mentioned by other groups. In the context of gender quotas, deposits, conducting of conferences and congress. Certainly all this is not conducive to uniformity of the case law, and we developed a number of recommendations. It is necessary to do all the consolidations at the level of the Supreme Court. However, consolidation of the case law data will not resolve the issue of the lack of uniformity. Therefore, some amendments are required to the electoral code on the basis of the available empirical data. We also recommend to conduct trainings for judges, not only prior to elections, but also between elections, with involvement of the National School of Judges of Ukraine for conducting trainings for the members of ECs. The members of our group also agreed that the case law is not uniform because of the frequent failure to abide by the recommendation of the Venice Commissions. Courts will be able to more efficiently apply the law if they always go by the recommendations of the Venice Commission, and the same pertains to the Parliament when it decides to amend the law.
Another problem that we
And
identified
one
was
other issue had to do with the pandemic. Courts often disallowed the use of video conferencing means for participation of parties in the hearings. And let me now address liability of EC members. We have listed 4 problems: failure to enforce the decisions of the courts, further to abide by them. We think that liability should be strengthened, that any failure to follow the decisions of the court should be punished, and we should also envisage individual liability of the members of ECs.
Скасовані судом або комісією вищого рівня.
Sometimes commissions would take decisions that were reversed by courts second time. So thus we should minimize the discretion of election commissions in what concerns the execution of court decisions. And the last but not least issue that has to do with the complaining procedure is that the EC commissions, including the management of the ECs, often neglect their own responsibilities. And here we have to focus on enhancing administrative and perhaps introduce criminal culpability for failure to perform the powers properly by the members and management of election commissions. Thank you very much. That would be it. Thank you, Pavlo. And we heard several requests from the attendees, and many of the speakers mentioned the use of IT and other electronic tools. So now we pass over to group 8, which will speak about introduction of electronic means and technologies into the election cycle. Thank you very much, Olena. I will be speaking about the use of ITs in the election cycle, and we focused on the following. We analyzed the practice of the use of the electronic office or cabinet, as we call it here, of a territorial election commission, the use of the DIA application in election processes, and some others. Now, when it comes to the practices of the use of the electronic cabinet by TECs, the issue is that some TECs liked the electronic cabinet so much that they recommended to always use this electronic cabinet, and they didn't always pay due attention to the paperwork. So there were some glitches with the electronic cabinet, but this has been addressed already by the administrators. We also mentioned the need to improve or expand for the TECs certain features of the electronic cabinet pertaining to security and safety. So, people said that it would be difficult to control access due to the high turnover within the commissions. And sometimes they said that they lacked opportunity to trace certain activities online by the administrator or the commission head. So we recommended that personal registration and identification for those who work with this electronic cabinet, and provide certain functions or features of the cabinet and make them accessible to specifically designated commission members. Now, speaking about the DIA application, an issue is that the election code of Ukraine does not provide for the details pertaining to the use of this application in the election procedures and processes. But there is a governmental resolution that actually allowed commissions to allow voters to produce their electronic passports with the use of the DIA application. So we believe that DIA can be used to provide services to the state voters register portal. And besides, we have to clearly define the procedure for the use of this application for the identification of voters by the Election Commission members. And another recommendation pertaining to this application is to introduce electronic personal invitations for the participation in the election via this application, and change the features of the application so that voters can actually introduce or apply for the introduction of certain changes into their data in the register. And some people said that the election commissions should have certified, quote unquote, smartphones in order to use the DIA application. I'm not sure what was meant, but they spoke about certified phones. And the very last block of proposals and challenges that those proposals were meant to meet or to address is the introduction of technical means of mutual checking of the data on calculation, tabulation, and results of the voting. And the proposal was to develop a tool that would allow such checking. And then when it comes to the calculation and tabulation, there were certain difficulties with the administering of the election process, and the recommendation was to introduce additional features or certain technical tools to simplify the processes of calculation and tabulation of votes, which will streamline the entire process. Inter alia in processing ballot papers and drawing protocols. We also discussed procedures of forming those documents and packaging them into the package of document to be submitted to higher level commissions. And again, the solution could lie with the introduction of automatic data verification at the stage of protocol drawing and their validation by higher level commissions. And we also discussed certain limitations due to the pandemic with the availability and accessibility for the EC members to work in the electronic cabinet. Some commissions worked only with the paper documents. So they had difficulty conducting online sessions, for example, or publicizing their decisions on their websites, or even actually having some corporate, say, features for those documents to be publicized online. When it comes to the certification, sometimes we observed low level of digital skills and competencies in the Commission's work with electronic tools. Our solution would be to offer training, to create certain education programs and additional materials in the form of electronic brochures, manuals, and video instructions on the use of electronic means and tools. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mihailo, and this will end the reporting or presentations of the working groups. We understand that elections are a mandatory democratic tool, and in order to address the problems with democracy is to introduce even more democracy. And the proposals and recommendations that we've developed could be an echo or the precursor to the changes in electoral processes, procedures, and pertinent legislation. So now I have to ask all of you whether you've got questions to ask. You can raise your electronic hands and then unmute your mics if you so wish. So I understand that's not the case. Then I will give the floor to Sergei Savely, who moderates the second part of this session. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for very informative and illuminating presentations. I'm Sergei Savely. I'm a senior advisor of IFES Ukraine. And during the entire conference, we've been speaking about our past, about our experiences, about what has already happened. Now we should discuss what lies ahead of us. And we will be discussing the ways to improve legislation and practices. And we will be discussing recommendations for the future. And we have invited the wide range of stakeholders. We've got with us Mr. Vitaly Plukhal, Deputy Head of Central Election Commission, Ms. Nata Dikia, Deputy Director of the National Democratic Institute, NDI, in Ukraine. With us, we also have Alisa Shishkovska, legal advisor of IFES Ukraine, and Ms. Olga Kotsyuruba, who is chief legal advisor of the civil network Opora. So the time frames for your interventions would be 10 to 12 minutes. And we expect very detailed presentations, and we also hope that you will respond to those presentations with very specific recommendations and general observations as well. So I will now give the floor to Mr. Vitaly Plukhal, Deputy Head of the Central Election Commission. The floor is yours. Thank you, Sergei. Good morning, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear participants. Now, summing up the discussions of the conference, virtual conference, which is quite an original one due to the COVID conditions. And I'm sure that those discussions will result in very practical steps, like amendments to the legislation and certain practical events and practical measures to improve the enforcement of the legislation. Indeed, the feedback of this conference is very varied and very valuable. Working groups raised a lot of very topical issues, both theoretical, conceptual, and procedural or technical ones, which is equally important. We usually pay very special attention not only to certain legislative issues, but also to the procedural challenges that arose during the elections, in particular on the 25th of October, so that we could bridge the gaps that we can see in the activities of the public authorities, in the legislation, and in the practices of election commissions. It was most interesting to hear about certain innovative approaches to certain challenges and addressing them. Should they be properly implemented? Should they find a reflection in improved legislation? I'm sure that the entire election process will be improved, will be made more transparent and fair. I would like to commend the working groups for their recommendations on the better criteria for the formation of election districts, clearer procedures on monetary deposits, on the gender quotas. These are the matters that territorial election commissions faced in their everyday work before, during, and after the elections. And today we haven't got very clear and very undubious approaches or very unanimous solutions to those matters and issues, and we still have a lot to discuss. When it comes to the formation of election commissions, timeframes, nominating candidates, and responsibilities and liability of commissions for their actions in activity should also be addressed in the future. Some election commissions, not systemically and not regularly, but still, there were certain cases when people neglected their powers and responsibilities, and they should be brought to answer. And I believe that the sanctions envisioned by legislation are not sufficient to discipline the election commissions and to actually defer them from further violations or irregularities. So we spoke about changed approaches to the complaints against actions or inactivity of the EC members, the revision of the hierarchical nature of such complaints, not necessarily going to one level above, but actually by expanding the range of stakeholders or a range of authorities that can respond to such complaints. So during the latest elections, and I hope you will agree with me in that, we did have certain cases, certain problems that we had to address immediately to prevent them from disrupting the entire election process. Another interesting proposal is about amending legislation to introduce provisions on early termination of powers of EC members or candidates that have been elected and then their powers should be terminated by the higher level commission or the court if those powers were obtained illegally. And one more thing that I've mentioned before, And it is about the situations when you cannot reinstate violated electoral rights because of the actions or inactivity of certain election commissions. We have to address this issue, perhaps through establishing certain culpability for ignoring such complaints, and so that we could minimize the number of cases when we cannot reinstate violated election rights. Central Election Commission in the future will continue to improve the election infrastructure, including IT tools and services, so that we meet the requirements of today, so that we should assist also other election commissions in exercising their powers. The Central Election Commission, at the very beginning of its powers, declared that we would be participating very actively in proposing amendments to election legislation to address those challenges and issues that we already see, that we have identified together with you during this conference, and we will pay special heed to your recommendations so that democratic processes in this country are advanced even more. We would also take on board recommendations provided by international partners, by the civil society organizations, so that every new election is conducted in a better way, and we have fewer and fewer issues and challenges. On behalf of the Central Election Commission, I would like to thank participants of this conference for very constructive discussions, for your active participation, and for providing very valid recommendations, both substantive and procedural. And I do hope that those recommendations will be implemented by the respective authorities, including CEC. Now, we will take them on board, and we will do our best to implement them. Thank you very much. Again, I would like to thank the organizers, our international partners, for their contribution. And it is very good that it has become a good tradition for us to meet together and discuss the outcomes of the elections, so that we can improve further practices. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Plukar. When the Central Election Commission was renewed in 2019, this authority began establishing different working groups, like, for example, on respecting the rights of people with disabilities, or on information technologies. We hope that this practice will continue, and that such working groups will develop important solutions. I have a question for Vitaly. We know that presently the Standing Committee of the Parliament is bringing together all the recommendations, and they want to come up with the draft amendments by February 17th. Does your commission plan to submit its inputs. Thanks for the question. We have already forwarded a list of issues to the parliamentary committee, and as for specific proposals, they will be submitted as I indicated earlier, and in view of recommendations of this conferences and of the recommendations of the international observing missions. These should be our priorities in order to avoid many of the problems we face now in the future. Thanks, Vitaly. And now I am giving the floor to my colleague, legal advisor to IFES, Alisa Shushkovska. She will outline the priority recommendations from our organization. Thank you, Serhiy, dear participants, dear colleagues. Welcome to the final part of our conference. IFES developed its recommendations on the outcomes of 2020 election. We worked with other missions. Our recommendations are similar to some of the recommendations from other groups of observers. Many of them were already voiced at this conference. This conference is to bring all the recommendations together in order to develop a roadmap of changes, inclusive of legislative changes, and this document is to reach the Parliament and our stakeholders. Our report is nearly ready. It contains a very detailed analysis of the issues, and it will also be provided to the stakeholders. Our priority recommendation of conceptual nature is that the Parliament considers the possibility of asking Venice Commission and ODIHR to develop opinions on the needed and necessary changes. Thus, the new provisions of our legislation will be in harmony with the international legislation. And right now, I'll vocalize some of our proposals regarding the election system. We consider modifying them in order to increase the level of political competition and increasing the influence of the voters on the results of the elections. The very first thing I want to stress is that independent candidates is to get the right to participate in elections at all levels. Local self-government is mostly about resolving local issues. That is why it doesn't seem reasonable that independent candidates may not run now. That, in fact, clashes with the Copenhagen document of 1990. And if we analyze the stats of this election in the majoritarian constituencies throughout Ukraine, the share of independent candidates was 31%, but such independents constitute 40% of those elected. That's why we think that self-nomination should be allowed with all changes in the registration procedures. We also think that the threshold should be made lower. From 25%, it should be reduced to 10% or even to 5%. Due to such an amendment, it will be possible to elect more candidates that are preferred by the voters and do not have just a safe places on the party slates. And by the way, occasionally on the party list, there was not a single candidate who would show a result better than the threshold. We also propose the possibility of annulling some provisions regarding guaranteed seats. Such a reserving in our review clashes with the very idea of open lists. It is feasible to apply such a proportionate system only to the bigger communities, like those with 35,000 residents plus, although this is debatable and should be further discussed at the Parliament with participation of the stakeholders. We recommend to establish a rule as per which every constituency is to be represented in the local government proportionately to the number of registered voters and not in proportion to the number of those who voted, because this may hit the very concept of balanced representation. We also suggest that CEC reconsiders the boundaries of the constituencies in order to find the most optimal solution. Another option that we suggest is giving a certain role to the regional representative officers of the CEC in the decision-making process on the constituency boundaries. Approximately 7% of ballots were deemed invalid throughout Ukraine. This is a huge number in our review, and it's a huge number of the opinions of our voters that were not taken into account. Some of the changes occurred right on the eve of the election process. Therefore, we all have to think about how to decrease the number of invalid votes in the future and about how to improve the procedures of voting for persons with a disability. Therefore, the CEC should review the design and the configuration of the ballots and think about simplifying them. We are supportive of such changes, although we understand that certainly some changes in the code will be required for that. As for election of mayors, it's a good idea to analyze all the pluses and minuses of the presently existing system with possible modifications. And if there is a big difference between the results of candidate number one and candidate number two, the winner might be announced on the basis of the results of the first round. We support Olhay Vazovsky's proposal voiced on day one regarding feasibility of conducting second rounds throughout Ukraine on one date that will create equal conditions for all candidates at this campaigning stage. Let me know something about elections not far from the contact line in the east. The Parliament of Ukraine should establish clear-cut legislative criteria so that civil military administrations can make better decisions about the possibility of conducting elections in their areas. As a result of such decisions, many individuals are deprived of the chance to elect their mayors. This happened in 18 communities this time, and such conclusions of the military and civic administration, civil administrations should be independently analyzed. And I call on all involved authorities to take relevant measures as soon as possible. We understand that the forthcoming chance will be in October. Regarding administration of elections, ECs should be made more professional, and therefore we think that the electoral code should carry a provision on mandatory certification of all members of commissions. Then candidates will be nominated only from those who underwent training and received certificates. Such a certification will resolve the problem of frequent replacement of election commission members, which was pointed at many a time by OSCE and other international organizations. Deadlines for replacements may also be introduced, and after a certain day, parties will not be able to replace their members in the commissions without solid grounds, the list of which should also be in the law. Regarding nomination of candidates, we have two recommendations in this regard. We think that different alleys of strengthening inter-partisan democracy should be analyzed, and it is also valid and viable to develop new rules regarding conduct of party conferences that nominate their candidates, with the mechanism of making such events more transparent, especially in the context of the now drafted law on political parties. As for the legal regulation of the procedures, it is important to be able to know whether a candidate is really a member of the political party or of its local chapter. According to the code, a person may be included into the list of local members of only one party as a party with no party affiliation or of a member of this party. And this may be regulated by the amended law on political parties. As for participation of women, I think we see consensus that all the requirements of a gender quota should be applied to the lists at all levels, including the time when the candidates are already withdrawn from the lists. And that will mean compliance with the gender quota on the election day. Another general recommendation of IFES is that oversight of compliance with the financing requirements should be in line with Greco recommendations and OSCE OD recommendations. Some other recommendations are quite specific. For example, one of them has to do with the early beginning of pre-election campaigns. We suggest that participants of the race be able to create their funds at an earlier stage, in respect of whether parties intend to spend their money on campaigning or not, plus obligatory reporting on all contributions into such funds, which will also increase the transparency. Regarding transparency of reports, there is a clear need in the establishment of a centralized e-register for financial reports, where the data should be easily accessible to all stakeholders, because the present system of financial data publication is not effective. We also suggest introducing ceilings on expenditures on certain kinds of advertising. Regarding the mass media, the National Council for Television and Radio Broadcasting should operate with full independence, inclusive of financial autonomy. Its controlling functions may be widening, with the possibility to sanction violating mass media. Thus, the Council will become a better regulator. As for the use of state-of-the-art technologies, I think that internet campaigning should be regulated, and better response to threats of disinformation is also required. In order to improve access of people with disability to election processes, all relevant regulations are to be brought in full compliance with the respective international standards, and the Cabinet of Ministers is to provide the relevant authorities with all resources required for the changes at the polling stations. All these recommendations will be in the report that I have already mentioned, and we hope that on the basis of all such recommendations, qualitative draft amendments to the EC and to the Electoral Code and other laws will appear. Thank you. Thank you.
Ще раз нагадати, що хоча наша конференція
On my behalf, I would like to remind you that even though this conference is about local elections, still having a unified election code as the document guiding everything in this area, we cannot focus narrowly only on local elections. So a lot of issues mentioned by the previous speaker and other experts on day one and day two, the moderators who presented the outcomes of their working group discussions, are equally applicable to local and parliamentary and presidential elections. Now, I would like to remind you yet again about your possibility to ask questions either in the Q&A window or by raising your electronic hand. Now I would like to give the floor to Deputy Director of the National Democratic Institute in Ukraine, Nadia Dikia. NDI is an organization that carried out a remote observation of the 2020 local elections from August 25 to At the end of October, they conducted a number of in-depth interviews. They interacted with a wide range of stakeholders and conducted a number of other measures as part of this remote observation. I would like Nadia to share her experiences of this observation and recommendations that ensue from them.
Thank you. Thank you, Sargi. I'm going to try to be very brief. First of all, greetings to the participants, organizers, and donors of the event. Thank you so much for having us on this panel. Also, great timing for the event, enabling the election stakeholders to reflect on the work done and compare notes and start working already today to prepare for the next round of elections is very, very timely. Before I will lay out NDI's vision on what should be improved and why, again, I'm going to try to be very brief. I want to take a moment to reflect on the 2020 elections. First and foremost, of course, Ukraine delivered yet another credible elections in the face of this unprecedented internal and external challenges. And in this extremely challenging context, these elections also brought the largest number of women to politics, and largest in the history of Ukraine, which is remarkable and something to be very proud of. A total of 280,000 candidates competed for mandates in these elections, and 125,000 were women, almost 45%. This is a pretty remarkable number. This is only to say that while Ukraine did well in these elections, of course, we can do better next time. So we collectively, of course, have a lot more work to do. There was a lot already said about by our partners from IFES, Opora, NMO, CC, and others about possible improvements to every aspect of elections. Therefore, I would like to focus today just recommendations related to the improvement of the electoral process and gender and inclusion. I won't be probably saying anything new. It's the day 3 of the conference, so a lot of this has already been said. Mostly, I probably will be reinforcing the recommendations that were voiced by the working groups 1, 2, and 3, I believe. The recommendations that I'm about to present are based on the observations of our virtual election assessment mission that was conducted end of September, and also based on the final report that we issued at the end of October that was based on the analysis of our long-term analysts who worked remotely. First recommendation is quite straightforward and very much in line what we are doing here today. It's related to the improvement of the electoral process. And the recommendation is that based on a comprehensive analysis of the application of the current legislation and recommendations from local and international observers, the Verkhovna Rada, together with the CC, should identify shortcomings and inconsistencies of the electoral framework and amend the election code accordingly to ensure uniform reading and clarity of the provisions for the next electoral cycle. In this context, we of course also welcome the initiative of the Verkhovna Rada Committee of the Local Governance to create a working group to develop comprehensive changes to the election legislative framework related to organization and conduct of elections. Second recommendation in this section is addressing the issue that while NDI found that the legal framework was conducive to holding democratic elections, the late adoption of some changes, the complexity of the new system, and various technical gaps presented challenges to all election stakeholders. Changes continued throughout the electoral process, and many proposals and decisions remained unresolved. And at times, the CC had a difficult role to play of balancing the need to clarify certain provisions of the election code while not overstepping its mandate. So therefore, the recommendation is that it will be important to ensure that future changes, significant changes to the legal framework governing elections are enacted at least 1 year prior to the election day. This would be consistent with international best practice and provide elections stakeholders with clear expectations about the election process. Okay, on the gender and inclusion, I will briefly describe the kind of issues that we still see remaining, and then I will talk briefly about the recommendations. So while the new electoral framework, of course, provides unprecedented opportunities for enfranchisement and participation of women, including through enforceable gender quota for party lists, there is still a room for improvement in ensuring that the balance between men and women on party list is maintained in the event of candidate replacement or withdrawal before or after election. Broadly speaking, Ukrainian political parties have complied with the gender quota requirement of the electoral legislation in nominating women candidates, and this is definitely a positive trend. However, many parties reported difficulties recruiting women candidates to meet the quota for their proportional list, especially in rural areas and smaller cities. Also, in addition, according to domestic observers, including Obora, women led only 22% of unified multi-member district proportional lists and 30.5% of territorial district proportional lists, which have impacted their chances of being elected. And also another area where worth noting is mayoral races that fall, of course, outside of the quota provision. These races remain extremely competitive for women as they require even more resources and support that women currently do not have. So there were no women elected mayors in any of the Ukraine's major cities. And the last kind of context point on that one is that the new legal framework has given IDPs the first opportunity to run for local elections since 2014 and has reduced their barriers to voting. However, this change, while this change affected approximately 5.5 million voters, due to limited public information efforts, only 100,000 voters changed their electoral address before the given deadline. So to address some of these challenges, our recommendations are the following: to the Verkhovna Rada to amend the election code to ensure the balance between men and women on party lists is maintained in the event of candidate replacement or withdrawal before or after election. Also, ensure principles of non-discrimination towards politically active women at the legislative level and implement effective mechanisms of combating violence. And we have specific set of recommendations also to the CSOs. To raise, the first recommendation is to raise public awareness of sexism and violence against women in elections. And second one is related to inclusion of IDPs and people with disabilities, that together with the CEC and political parties develop robust public information efforts on the new accessibility measures for voters with disabilities and new procedures for changing voter addresses for IDPs and other people residing in places that other than their permanent addresses. And we have a set of recommendations also for political parties, and that's something that we are actively working on a daily basis. These recommendations are mostly concerning the inclusion of women. So involve women in the party activities and improve their capacity to run for the office by providing support during the election campaign, political mentorship, and development of women's wings. Also, to develop inclusive policies and gender-sensitive strategies to ensure political participation of women from underrepresented groups. And introduce women to the leadership position in parties, as well as include female members and activists into internal decision-making processes, namely in the process of forming electoral lists. So that's very briefly what I wanted to tell you about this part of our election observation. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Natya, for this very detailed presentation. If I may, I would actually reflect on what you have said and perhaps ask further questions and a question of you. We see that the legislation in terms of ensuring better representation of women has been advanced, and it's improved of late. It is for the first time ever that gender quotas were introduced in relation to local elections. At the same time, we see that in parallel with the legislative amendments, we need to work to mainstream gender issues in the work with the parties and in the activities of the political parties themselves. Perhaps you would have certain recommendations as to what measures should be taken. And I can see that we have representatives of political parties amongst our participants and attendees. So what would be non-legislative measures that can be implemented in order to advance women's representation even further? What do you say?
Thank you for this question, Sergey. Maybe I was not clear, but I did address this in my talking points. I will reiterate it because this is something that I care deeply about. So I'm happy to repeat. So to political parties, we've issued a set of recommendations that we are also discussing with political parties individually. And these recommendations are that political parties involve women in party activities at the leadership level to improve their capacity to run for the office. And that support can be varying. It can be providing political mentorship, also investing more in developing women's wings, and also providing women extra support during the election campaign. Also, parties need to develop inclusive policies and gender-sensitive strategies to ensure that women from underrepresented groups are also included in these processes. And also, they need to actively include female members and activists into decision-making processes in the party, and especially in the process of forming electoral lists.
Дуже дякую, Натя, за коментар. Власне,
Thank you, Natya, for this comment. I heard that the first time, but I did that on purpose for other participants to actually pay special heed to these issues, because in Ukraine, oftentimes people believe that everything should be addressed at the legislative level. But we understand that there are a lot of practical matters, some procedural issues that can be addressed otherwise than by lawmakers, but by the parties themselves in their everyday activities. Now, I would like to give the floor to our colleague, representative of the leading organization in the elections observation. Ola Kotsuruba is Chief Legal Advisor of the civil network Opora. Their recommendations might be of special value in that Opora, alongside some other NGOs and CSOs, were on the ground, unlike some international observers who actually did that remotely due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But the Opora observers were on the ground and they had some first-hand experience, and perhaps their recommendations will be very nitty-gritty and very detailed. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sergey, for the introduction of our organization. We speak last, but I understand that we are not lost in the election processes and in observation of those processes. We are also very experienced in providing recommendations, even as so, as Natya said, it's difficult to be quite original on the third day of the conference. And we can see that we have a lot in common when addressing the existing issues, and we have some repetitive recommendations, but that's an upside, because thus we can come up with a consolidated position. We, I mean the CSOs, local observers, and international observation missions. I try to summarize all of our recommendations in this presentation. And again, sometimes I will be repetitive, and but it is sometimes important to reiterate some of the recommendations. We, together with IFOS, developed a roadmap of sorts to improve legislative framework for the local and national elections, and we are preparing a list of such recommendations and proposed amendments to submit to the Verkhovna Rada Commission, and we can take a concerted position in actually protecting those proposals and amendments. The change of the procedure of decision-making by civil and military administration in eastern regions of Ukraine, particularly close to the contact line. CEC, as far as we know, quite recently applied to those military civil administrations, seeking their opinion of whether elections can be conducted there, but unfortunately those administrations did not grasp that opportunity, and we still have 18 communities that did not have elections. And over the next year, it will be one of the top priorities for PORA to negotiate these issues with the military civil administrations. They are now more open to cooperation and negotiations, particularly in Luhansk Oblast. And the impossibility to conduct elections in those 18 communities is different because their preparedness is different. The safety levels are different. And we can see that public services are provided, some administrative services are provided, so people can be or should be guaranteed their the exercise of their electoral rights. So we cooperate with international organizations and with the Verkhovna Rada Committee, perhaps with representatives of the Ministry of Defense, to develop concerted criteria again about decision-making in this regard. Now, speaking about the election system, I won't repeat what has already been said. With the 25% quota for the inflation of the candidates in the election list, and we know of various sometimes opposite opinions of MPs with regard to the ways the electoral legislation can be improved, particularly with regard to the so-called guaranteed mandates and the quota of 25%, as I said. So we find polarly opposite opinions by the MPs. And some MPs say that it should be lowered to 10%, and some say that it should be raised to 50%. So we will be actually pushing for our own position, but we can't see any promising prospects for the compromise or let alone consensus. So the strategy of our organization is to actually point out certain drawbacks in the existing election system and its failure to meet all of the international standards, while developing certain amendments to the legislation, particularly in those areas where consensus is
we
possible.
already see some
And-
understanding about the need to change the rules of campaigning, especially with regard to the social networks. The same pertains to financial reporting or to the role of the media. So together with the reforming of the decision-making process by the military civil administration, this is going to be another major priority in our activities in the coming year. As for the gender quota and compliance with the relevant requirements, we know that some TECs did not comply with the gender quota requirements, like, for example, 2 out of 5 rule. So the recommendations that we are going to be developing should be linked with the coming stages of informatization. The list submitted by a party will be immediately uploaded into the system, and the system will red flag the instances of incompliance. We know that some commissions were doing registration in spite of the failure to observe the rules, although in other instances there were refusals to grant registration, to which parties immediately responded by letters alleging they have made a mistake or that there was a technical error. However, in many instances, such manipulations resulted in establishment of the final version of the list by a court decision. So what we really need is an e-system which would immediately alert the commissions to the mistakes and results in the conduct of conferences and of the parties in an environment when data is available and accessible, and any person can see the list, which would make nomination congresses transparent. We see another big issue in the fact that political parties often make female candidates submit own applications of withdrawal of candidacy. We understand that it is impossible to control everything here. Certainly, any candidate can decide to withdraw her candidacy either at the campaigning stage or even after election. But any mechanism requiring a replacement by a person of the same gender would not be democratic, as many experts maintain. Anyhow, this procedure should be somehow improved after relevant discussions, so that a candidate that withdraws her candidacy is replaced by a candidate of the same gender. And I fully agree with all other recommendations that were vocalized by Yulia Zaitseva today. Our monitoring is showing that territorial commissions do not succeed in proper publication of reports, to say nothing of analysis. They don't have leverage to do checkups or to furnish requests or to do full-fledged examination of the report. So we'll continue our dialogue with the anti-corruption agencies, to involve them and to make financial reports of the parties more uniform. And this is going to be another priority of our future work. We'll also think about what else can be done in order to make finance more transparent. And we have already suggested changes to the existing laws. Banks are providing data on expenditures from election funds. And every organization the expenses are shown daily on the portal of the Treasury. And I believe that similarly banks could provide information to the CEC, and it could make it public and refresh this information, if not every day, then at least regularly. But once again, funding and relevant IT resources are required for that. However, such means cannot constitute a banking secret. This is public data, but there were instances when such data was not provided to us immediately, in spite of the fact that in 7 days they are anyhow to appear in public domain. But anyhow, information should be provided more promptly, and that certainly concerns the forthcoming parliament elections. Please try to be briefer. Yes, I understand the time limit. Another thing that was mentioned but was not really discussed is that individuals who are in remand prisons could not vote because ECs were not established at those facilities. The provisions in the law on those who have the right to vote mention individuals who serve their prison terms. But those who are in remand prisons could not realize their voting rights. As for inclusiveness of the electoral process, our key proposal is that all polling stations are brought into conformity with the rules regarding accessibility. But nothing is said about any transitional periods. So local governments are always writing in their official letters that they still have time to implement the measures. Legislations of other countries like the Czech Republic provided for certain percentages as indicators to be achieved every year or at least stage. And this is something that we are going to propose with regards to amendment to the EEC. We are also aware of multiple cases of problems with regard to the registration of voters or to the change of address. Carolina Bogaz community is exemplary in this sphere. In other territorial communities, the number of citizens prior to the election day increased several times. In one community, this growth was eightfold. So I think that together with the prosecutor's offices and together with the migration authorities, we are to think about how to avoid such situations in the future, and specifically how to avoid the use of the negative manipulative technologies, or how to hold to account those who were culpable. As for the current electoral code, the provisions on campaigning are weaker than those in the previous code signed by Parubey. So something should be done regarding the media and regarding the role of the National Council for Television and Radio Broadcasting as the regulator in order to ensure the impact of the regulator and the freedom of the media. So these are our key points, and this is what we are going to focus on next year. This year and next year. Thanks, Olga, and thanks for mentioning the roadmap. That roadmap was our joint paper. It was approved in April 2020. And if we now look at that paper, we'll see that very many recommendations therein have been carried out and put into practice. I may recall you of the adoption in the second reading of the draft law on referendum. However, this process is continuous, and I'm very grateful to your organization for cooperation. And not too many questions have come in, but in the chat there is some interesting discussion about trading of election commission members and their certification. What does Mr. Plukar think about certification? Who has to be certified? The chairperson of the commission, his or her deputy, or all of them? Thanks, Ruhi, for the question. I think that in the future, certification should become not just a requirement, but a reality. And I think that in the future, all members of ECs should be certified for the sake of their professional level. But in view of real time, in view of the logistical limitations will have to begin with the leaderships of the ECs regarding certification. Prior to elections, the head positions in ECs are changed. Therefore, we should think about certification of members of the ECs and of those who may be involved in performing senior duties. Thank you, Vitaly. And that's the end of the last round of our discussion. We have a lot to think about. We have a lot to consider with regard to what's going to happen in the future, or with regard to what amendments should be made in the law and what changes should occur in the practices. And now we want to give the floor to Deputy Director of IFES, Georgi Kobakhidze. He will address our plans for the future too.
Thank you, Sergey. Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. Greetings to everyone, and happy Friday. Nice to see the sun has also come out to join us on this last day of the event. Before we say goodbye, and since we could not meet in person, we decided to share one last treat with all of you. As the saying goes, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and given the historic significance of the 2020 local elections, together with the CEC, we would like to screen a very short video that highlights some of the key moments and challenges that Ukraine overcame in 2020. So I'd like to ask my colleague to share the video, and then I'll close with the final word.
25 жовтня в Україні
On
відбулися.
October the 25th, local elections took place in Ukraine. They were also took place during the pandemic and under the new election code. Notwithstanding all the challenges, the process was well organized and was highly assessed by international and national observers. So what were the challenges that different bodies faced? These local elections were probably the most difficult ones in the history of Ukraine, because of the new electoral systems, changes in the electoral legislation, the imperfections in this law, the decentralization reform. However, our primary challenge emerged because of the pandemic. Quarantine restrictions complicated the management of the preparations and gave rise to problems with funding. The CEC put a lot of effort into organizing local elections at the highest level. Given the current circumstances, the election commissioners' training included not only the overview of the new legislation and the new electoral system, but also the safety measures under quarantine restriction. The Central Election Commission actively addressed discrepancies in the legislation to resolve the problems with new regulations and to address the issues that haven't been regulated by the code. Together with international partners, we conducted a large-scale awareness campaign. Educational videos were broadcast on TV channels and on the internet. The informational platform CEC Prosvita was also created. Members of territorial and precinct election commissions play an important role in the local election process. Territorial election commissions register candidates and party lists. They form the precinct commissions. They work with the voter register, approve the text of the print ballots. They receive, analyze, and make public the finance reports. They establish the results of the election. Precinct election commissions conduct the voting on the election day, count the votes when polling stations are closed. On October 25th, 2020, Zhenya Slobodenko was heading the polling station of district number 215 in Kyiv. From early morning till midnight, voters were coming in steadily. There was no overcrowding, no massive influx of people. This certainly impacted our work. It made it comfortable and convenient for those individuals with a temperature higher than 37.2 degrees voted in a special booth. They were casting their ballots into a special ballot box. All pandemic precautions were observed. All tables were disinfected. All booths were disinfected. Voters were using their own pens. The process of the vote counting was somewhat different from the previous election. There we were counting ballots one by one. This time the volume of our work increased twofold. We counted votes for the mayor and then counted the votes for the council deputies. Due to the trainings, the work of the commissioners was facilitated. Elections should be accessible to every citizen. That's why IFES, in partnership with the civil society and with the support of USAID, Global Affairs Canada, UK Aid, is working to promote inclusive nature of elections and their access for all, including people with disabilities, IDP, and others. Nadia Peshkova has been living in Kyiv for 5 years, but only this year she had the opportunity to vote. I lived in Kyiv for 6 years. I've been paying taxes. I've been using public transport. My child has been going to school here, but I did not feel a full-fledged member of the community because I could not elect the local government. On October 25th, I could do that. It was a very important day for me. The election was conducted under the new system with open lists, so I was voting not only for the political party, but also for the political parties that I would like to see in the local council. That put additional responsibility on me. Ihor Timofeyev is a student. He is convinced that it is the duty of every citizen to vote. That's why as soon as he turned 18, he went to the polling station to show his civic position. We are to go and vote. We are to show that our votes matter, that they cannot be forged. We are the driving force of the changes in the society. Accessible, fair, and transparent elections are the foundation of democratic progress.
We hope you enjoyed this short visual representation of the 2020 local elections. It is truly a testament to the incredible efforts made by many on this call and many who took part in the Lessons Learned event and led by the Central Election Committee. We at IFES, together with our partners, the Central Election Commission, Council of Europe, OSCE Project Coordinator in Ukraine, thank all of you for your engagement and most importantly for your recommendations for further strengthening elections in Ukraine. It is in between elections that significant continued reform can be realized. This window of time offers a great opportunity for input from all stakeholders and offers the needed time for public education efforts of any changes that are decided. Over the days to come, IFES, together with partners, will carefully collate and refine many of the recommendations that have arisen from this conference. Recommendations that have arisen from the over 200 participants in attendance and from the thematic working groups. This input will join existing Observer and IFES recommendations and will be offered to the Verkhovna Rada in mid-February, when members of parliament consider additional legal reform to the legislation. As we say goodbye, I want to thank all of the partners who made this impressive gathering a success, with a special shout out to Natalia Olasiuk, who led the way. I would also like to express our gratitude to the United States Agency for International Development, Global Affairs Canada, and UK Aid for their continued support to democratic progress in Ukraine. And finally, once again, I would like to congratulate the Central Election Commission for the resolve and professionalism they have demonstrated over this extremely challenging period. We wish all of you a safe, restful weekend, and we look forward to working with all of you in the months ahead to realize many of the key ambitions that have arisen. Thank you all very much, and to be continued. Have a great weekend.